Introduction to Personality Psychology, Part 2 of 2. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Let's look at some other components of personality. First of all, I'd like to talk to you about some features of personality. Now, these will partially reinforce Allport's standard definition of personality traits. To start with, personality is the property of an individual. Your personality belongs to you. It wasn't assigned to you. It is yours, and yours only. It is a characteristic of you as an individual. Secondly, when we talk about personality psychology, often we talk about the distinction between the nomenclatic versus ideographic research approaches. These are big words, simple meanings. Nomenclatic research is what we typically think about when we think about psychological research. It's like group research, experimental designs using lots of people. Ideographic research comes from the Greek idios, as nomos comes from nomenclatic, and it means individual. It's a case study approach. School psychology, for example, uses a lot of single subject designs in their research. Freud's use of case studies is an ideographic approach to personality. Another thing that personality does is it organizes you, and it organizes your thoughts, your behaviors, your patterns, and to a large extent your physiology. So personality organizes our psyche. It's an active process. We don't get home at night, take our personality off like we do our coat and hang it in the closet. Personality is always functioning, always active. You can't shut it off. And it always affects your behavior. Why do we know there's personality? What is one of the major clues to the existence of personality in organisms? Well, personality shows up in patterns and recurrences. Generally, we behave relatively the same. Not perfectly the same, but relatively the same across time and across situations. And we talk about this in terms of personality consistency. Think about the people that you really know well. You can probably predict generally what they're going to do in any given situation. Whether it's different situations, whether it's across time. If you think about these things, you can generally predict what people will do. So if you're going out for the weekend with a group of friends and people are fussing around and thinking about where you're going to go, what you're going to do, there'll always be somebody that's up for one thing and not for something else. You can predict that if you suggest something to one person, they'll always give you the same kind of answer back. My best friend in the department, who I eat lunch with on a very regular basis, always orders the exact same thing at the restaurant that we tend to frequent. He's been doing it for 30 years. If I were to go into the restaurant with him and Matt ordered something other than sweet and sour pork, I think I would be freaked out, and I think the wait staff would be freaked out too. Other people are not that consistent, but we know people do relatively the same things. We're not robots, we don't do the same things, so the relative is a major component here. Let's look at some major components of personality. This isn't a complete list. If we're going to talk about personality traits, my favorite topic, how can we look at a human's personality traits? We have to come up with a notion of how many traits does it take to explain personality. That's a major issue in our field. And if you were to look in the literature, you'll find many, many different models that are based on large sets of different traits. How are those traits organized? We'll talk about one model of personality where the traits are organized in a circular fashion. We'll talk about another model where the traits are organized in a hierarchical fashion. Where do these traits come from? In part 1 of this video, I talked about the work of Hans Eysenck. He believes that each of his major personality traits are related to biological substrates. And you have to look at that one. The Big Five doesn't necessarily provide an origin for each of the 5 traits. So where do these traits come from? Are they genetic? Are they learned? That's an important thing to think about when you're modeling personality traits. Finally, what are the consequences of having any given trait? We know, for example, that ill-tempered, nasty men, over the course of their life, have trouble holding jobs. They make less money than their fathers, adjusted for inflation, over the course of their lifetimes. Kind of big issue there, lifetime earnings. Reflects ultimately your things like retirement, which I know most of you aren't thinking about at all. But it does factor in. Shy people like me tend to do things what we call off time, later than their non-shy peers. And those include things like getting married, having children, starting full-time career path jobs. We'll talk about that research in detail later in the course. But there are important consequences to having different personality traits. We can also talk about traits as motivated behavior that lead you in a certain direction. Here's an old word, but I like the word purposive. You do behavior on purpose. Or your behavior may in turn be goal-directed. All of these are different kind of motivated behavior. You might be sitting in your room listening to this lecture, reading your textbooks, doing other kind of school-related tasks, and your friends might be sitting in the other room having a wonderfully good time. A lot of times when we're motivated to do something, we might do behaviors that don't seem to fit in the situation. But sequestering yourself off to study to get good grades shows career motivation and path motivation. And you might study whether you're in your dorm room or an apartment, whether you're at home with your parents, maybe commuting to school. Some of you may be able to study on the job. I never had one of those jobs where you could sit back and sneak and study for a while. But motivated behavior, it's an important area of behavior. And we do know that highly motivated people behave fundamentally differently than people who aren't motivated. In fact, one of my mentors, the late great Jack Atkinson, who studied achievement motivation, doesn't talk about people with a lack of motivation. He talks about people who have a motive to avoid failing rather than achieving success. We can also talk about personality as your system of psychological mechanisms. This is more of a cognitive type of view, and your personality is based on how you process input and output rules. What kind of decision rules do you use to behave in certain systematic areas? In the Dan McAdams article, he talks about conditional behaviors. If something happens, how do you react to it? You know, the old movie cliche fits in here. If I build it, he will come. If I ask somebody out in a certain way, will they go on a date with me? All those kinds of things. This is a more modern view. It's largely based on evolutionary psychology. We can also talk about another evolutionary perspective, adaptations. What fundamental characteristics have we inherited from our ancestors that lead to us behaving in certain ways? That's pretty much my whole Psychology 157 evolution class, to give you a little advertisement. But we do know that people are behaving based on the adaptations that they inherited from their ancestors. These can be both physical and psychological. One great example of that is inborn fears. We all generally have a fear of snakes. Some people have what Freud would call a reaction formation, which is an emotional flip-flop, and love snakes. That's not me. Because snakes are dangerous critters, and better to avoid all snakes, venomous and non-venomous, than take a chance of playing with a snake that might kill you. So we have an inborn fear of things like snakes. We also have inborn fears of heights. You should feel a little anxious if you're out in the open up high someplace, because you might fall and get hurt. Let's talk about how personality is related to the environment. We'll actually spend an entire unit on this, but I want to introduce the topic here because it's an important one. We have something called the fundamental attribution bias. And this is a problem with studying personality, because we tend to attribute characteristics of the environment to the individuals that populate that environment. Here's a still shot from one of the most famous social psych studies of all, Zimbardo's prison study. Take some college students, randomly split them into prisoners and guards, and within a couple of weeks, the guards are turning into hardcore authoritarian types, and the prisoners are rebelling against authority and having a strike. So these folks were just randomly plucked out. They weren't authoritarian or anti-authoritarian when they came into the study, but they had these roles, and we think of these people in terms of their roles rather than their true personality characteristics. And this is something important to think about. Are we judging the person on their role or their personality? You've probably experienced many different professors at this point in your academic career, and you may make the assumption that anyone with a bunch of letters behind their names are inherently smart. Well, I know enough many different people in this field and other fields and on the campus I work on who have letters behind their names who I don't think as being terribly that bright. Of course, they might think the same of me, but because someone is a professor, you make the attribution they may be highly intelligent. And if you think about that with any kind of role, oftentimes we place the personality characteristics of the role to the person rather than their true characteristics. When we look at person and environment fit, we can look at these things. Another famous social psych study is the Milgram obedience study. When I used to teach intro psych years and years ago, my personal philosophy was, In an intro psych class, you need to show the Zimbardo prison study movie, the Milgram obedience study, and a good Skinner pigeon movie. Anything else after that is just added value, but you need those minimally for a good class. The Milgram study, too, favors the environment. You put people in a very restricted environment and order them to do things, and they tend to do it. Well, there are very many permutations on the Milgram study, and if you look carefully at the Milgram study, you find that when conditions are less restrictive, more personality stuff comes out. So when you really, really restrict personality, you don't get a lot of individual differences. When you have a loose environment, which is what we call environments with a lot of room for interpreting, personality generally tends to come out in those environments. The only problem is reality is someplace in the middle, and the middle is terribly difficult to study. One thing in the environment may greatly affect you, another may be insignificant. I'm a fan of the show that recently ended, Big Bang Theory. If you look at the characters in Big Bang Theory, and I know it's not real science by any means, the running gags in Big Bang Theory were that the three lead character guys were outrageously strong, nerdy types, and like to do things like play video games, go to the comic book store, things like that. And then the female leads, especially the Penny character, could care less about those things. So what's important to you in an environment also may not be important to another person. We have to take that into consideration when we're studying such phenomena. Here's your trivia for this lecture. This is a still picture from a made-for-TV movie from a very long time ago about the Milgram study. It's not a very good movie, but the lead character, the Stanley Milgram character, is played by William Shatner, who also captained the Starship Enterprise in the first iteration of Star Trek. So he went from Milgram to space. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved. Bye now.